"You're done, Vance. The board doesn't approve overpaid directors." Julian Mercer sneered, sliding the termination papers forward. I smiled, signing the document immediately. He thought he was saving a $1.2 million commission. He didn't know he just triggered a clause that would empty his $100 million flagship plaza by Monday morning. Let me rewind 15 years. In 2011, I joined Summit Realty Trust as a senior leasing director. Back then, downtown Seattle's commercial real estate market was rising, and Summit was a mid-sized firm looking to play in the big leagues. I brought a decade of industry relationships with me. I was 33 years old, hungry, and willing to work 80-hour weeks. The founder, George Mercer, was a real estate titan of the old school. He understood that commercial property wasn't about glass and steel. It was about relationships, leverage, and trust. Under George's guidance, I spent years securing the tenants that built Summit's reputation. The crown jewel of our portfolio was Summit Plaza, a 20-story, class commercial office tower in the heart of Seattle's business district. For years, we operated on a simple formula. I found the tenants, structured the leases, and kept the building at 98% occupancy. In return, George paid me a competitive base salary and a performance-based commission. In 2016, when we landed Sinclair Technologies as our anchor tenant, George signed an amendment to my employment contract. It was a standard industry incentive. I would receive a 3% commission on the total value of any major commercial tenant renewals I personally secured. Sinclair Technologies was a giant. They occupied the top 10 floors of Summit Plaza, spanning 250,000 square feet. Their annual rent was $8 million. In the world of commercial real estate, an anchor tenant like Sinclair is everything. They pay the bills. They attract smaller retail tenants to the lobby, and they give the bank the confidence to finance the property. Their lease represented 60% of Summit Plaza's total revenue. But by 2026, the market had shifted. Remote work had hollowed out downtown offices. Vacancy rates were climbing, and commercial property valuations were dropping. Sinclair's initial 10-year lease was set to expire at the end of the year. For the last 9 months, I had been locked in intense daily negotiations with Edward Sinclair, the CEO of Sinclair Technologies. Edward was 55, sharp and practical. He knew the market was in a downturn. He had already received attractive offers from developers in the suburbs offering custom campuses at half the rent. "Adrian," Edward had told me over dinner in June, "the board wants us to downsize and move out to Bellevue. It saves us $4 million a year. The only reason I'm even sitting at this table is because of you. If we stay at Summit Plaza, I need to know the building's operations will remain flawless. Our server rooms and clean labs cannot afford a single minute of downtime. You've managed this property for a decade, and you've never let us down." To keep Sinclair, I worked around the clock. I negotiated custom tenant improvement allowances, restructured the parking access, and worked out a 5-year renewal plan at the existing rate of $8 million per year. The total value of the lease renewal was $40 million. According to my 2016 contract amendment, my 3% commission on this deal would be $1,200,000. It was a massive payout, but it was a fraction of the $40 million I was securing for Summit Realty Trust. By late August 2026, the contract was ready. The signing ceremony was scheduled for Friday morning at 10. Edward Sinclair had agreed to the terms, and the draft agreements were finalized. Then came the change in leadership. George Mercer, at 65, decided to step down due to health reasons. He remained on the board but handed the day-to-day operations of the company to his nephew, Julian Mercer. Julian was 32 years old, armed with a fresh MBA from an Ivy League school, and possessed the dangerous combination of extreme arrogance and zero practical leasing experience. To Julian, the commercial real estate business was simple. You cut costs, you squeeze tenants, and you collect your bonus. He looked at the company's payroll and saw my commission structure as an unnecessary expense. Julian didn't understand the history. He didn't know that back in 2016, during the original lease negotiations, Edward Sinclair had demanded a protective clause in the contract. Sinclair Tech was investing $15 million of their own money into specialized clean rooms and heavy server equipment in our building. They wanted a guarantee that the property would be managed by someone who understood their technical infrastructure. Edward had insisted on Section 14.4, which we called the Keyman and Asset Management Clause. It was a simple, restrictive covenant. It stated that Sinclair Technologies' lease agreement was contingent upon my direct, personal management of the property as the designated property director and tenant liaison. If I were to be terminated, reassigned, or cease to manage the tenancy, for any reason other than voluntary resignation, Sinclair Technologies had the absolute right to terminate the lease with 10 days written notice without penalty or liability. To Julian Mercer, this clause was just obscure legal boilerplate that he likely hadn't even read. He was focused entirely on the upcoming third-quarter financial report. If he could secure Sinclair's renewal and simultaneously eliminate my $1.2 million commission, his department's net margins would skyrocket. He would look like a financial genius to the board, and he would secure a $500,000 personal performance bonus. On Thursday afternoon, less than 24 hours before the scheduled signing with Sinclair Technologies, I was summoned to the executive suite on the penthouse floor. Walking past the glass walls, I could see Julian Mercer sitting at the large mahogany desk that used to belong to his uncle. Beside him sat Sarah Croft, the newly hired HR director who had earned a reputation as Julian's personal hatchet officer. I sat down, placing my notebook on the table. Julian didn't look up immediately. He was scrolling through his phone, intentionally making me wait. It was a cheap power play, the kind taught in executive seminars. When he finally looked up, his face was masked with a cold, professional smile. "Adrian," Julian said, leaning back in his chair. "Thanks for coming up. We've been looking over the departments overhead as we transition into this new phase of growth. We appreciate your 15 years of service to Summit, but we've decided to restructure the leasing division. As of today, your position is redundant." I stared at Julian Mercer for a long, quiet moment. The silence in the penthouse office grew heavy, but I kept my breathing steady and my expression completely neutral. "Redundant?" I asked, my voice flat. "Julian, I've spent the last 9 months negotiating the Sinclair Technologies renewal. We are signing the agreement tomorrow morning at 10. That contract secures $40 million in revenue for this company over the next 5 years. Julian smirked, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the polished wood desk. "Exactly, Adrian. The contract is negotiated. The terms are locked. The work is done. Tomorrow's meeting is just a formality, a signature on a dotted line. We don't need a senior leasing director earning a massive commission just to hand a pen to Edward Sinclair. We have junior managers who can do that for a fraction of your cost." Sarah Croft slid a folder across the desk. "We've drafted a separation agreement for you, Adrian. We are offering you a severance package of 3 months' base salary, which comes to $45,000. In exchange, you will sign a standard release of claims, including a waiver of any commissions on pending or unclosed deals, and a comprehensive non-compete clause that restricts you from working with any commercial real estate firms in the Seattle metropolitan area for the next 24 months. I opened the folder and read the terms. It was a joke. They were asking me to walk away from a $1.2 million commission that I had rightfully earned, and in exchange, they were offering $45,000 while legally banning me from earning a living in my own city for 2 years. "And if I refuse to sign this?" I asked. Julian's eyes narrowed. "If you don't sign, we terminate you for cause. We'll claim you failed to align with the new corporate structure and failed to meet department efficiency targets. You won't get a dime of severance, and we'll tie you up in court for years if you try to sue for the commission. You're 51, Adrian. Do you really want to spend your savings on lawyers fighting a multi-million-dollar trust?" He thought he had me cornered. He believed that my age and the fear of legal bills would force me to take the crumbs he was offering. But I knew the law, and more importantly, I knew the Sinclair lease agreement. If I accepted the severance, the non-compete and the waiver would bind my hands. If I rejected it, they would fire me anyway, but I would remain a free agent. The waiver they wanted me to sign was designed to protect Summit Realty Trust from employee lawsuits, but it had no power over third-party lease contracts. I closed the folder and slid it back to Sarah Croft. I'm passing on the severance package, I said calmly. Julian laughed, a dry, mocking sound. Are you serious? You'd rather walk out of here with nothing? I value my freedom more than $45,000, I replied. I'll take the termination. Send my final paycheck and my accrued vacation time to my home address. Sarah looked surprised, but Julian just shrugged. Suit yourself, Adrian. Your choice. Hand over your keycard and your company laptop to Sarah. Security will escort you to your desk to pack your personal belongings. You have 30 minutes. I stood up, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked out. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't slam the door, and I didn't make a scene. In my 15 years at Summit, I had seen hot-headed executives ruin their careers by losing their temper. I knew that anger was a useless emotion. Strategy was what mattered. The walk down to the 14th floor was quiet. Under the watchful eye of a junior security guard, I packed my personal items into a single cardboard box. My framed photographs, a few industry awards, and my personal reference books. The office staff watched in stunned silence. Rumors spread fast in a commercial real estate office, and everyone knew that the Sinclair signing was tomorrow. They couldn't understand why the man who had built the deal was being escorted out of the building. At 4:30 p.m., I walked out of the lobby of Summit Plaza and placed the cardboard box in the trunk of my car. The Seattle afternoon air was cool. I sat in the driver's seat, pulled out my personal phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. Edward Sinclair answered on the second ring. Adrian. Just reviewing the final draft you sent over. We are all set for 10 tomorrow. I've got the board's approval. Edward, I said, keeping my tone professional but direct. There's been a change in plans. I was terminated by Summit Realty Trust 20 minutes ago. There was a long silence on the line. What do you mean, terminated? You negotiated this entire deal. We're signing tomorrow. Julian Mercer has taken over day-to-day operations, I explained. He restructured the department and eliminated my role. He wants to avoid paying my commission and plans to have a junior associate handle the signing tomorrow. Edward's voice went cold. He fired you to save a buck? The day before we sign a 5-year commitment? Yes, I said. He believes the deal is locked and that my involvement is no longer necessary. Edward let out a low, angry growl. That arrogant little idiot. He doesn't know who he's dealing with. Adrian, I told George 10 years ago, and I've told my board every year since. We stay in that building because of you. When our cooling systems failed in the summer of 2018, you were in the basement at 3 a.m. with the technicians to keep our servers online. When the city tried to rezone the access road, you fought the council and won. We don't trust Summit Realty Trust. We trust you. I appreciate that, Edward, I said. What about Section 14.4? Edward asked. The keyman clause, it's still in the active lease, right? It is, I confirmed. The clause states that if I am terminated or cease to manage the tenancy for any reason other than voluntary resignation, Sinclair Technologies has the absolute right to terminate the lease with 10 days written notice without penalty. Since they fired me, the clause is fully active. The unsigned renewal tomorrow is irrelevant because the current master lease is what governs your tenancy. Perfect, Edward said. Our legal team is going to have a field day. We've actually been looking at a new office campus in Bellevue. The landlord there has been begging us to sign, offering us 3 months of free rent and a lower rate, but we stayed out of loyalty to you. Now, we have our exit. I'm calling our general counsel right now. We aren't signing anything tomorrow. Instead, Julian Mercer is going to receive a very different kind of document. Friday morning at 9:30, the atmosphere in the executive suite of Summit Realty Trust was festive. Julian Mercer had ordered premium catering, and bottles of expensive champagne were chilling in ice buckets. A junior leasing manager named Mark Higgins stood by, holding a leather-bound folder containing the Sinclair Technologies lease renewal documents. Julian was wearing a tailored suit, smiling and chatting with the HR director, Sarah Croft, about the upcoming third-quarter earnings report. This is how you run a modern real estate firm, Sarah, Julian said, gesturing to the contract folder. $40 million locked in, and we saved $1.2 million in overhead. That's pure profit added to our bottom line. My uncle was too soft. He thought you had to buy people off with massive commissions to keep them loyal. In the new economy, everyone is replaceable. At 9:45, the elevator doors opened. But it wasn't Edward Sinclair who stepped out. It was a courier carrying a formal, red-stamped legal envelope. The courier approached the receptionist, requested a signature, and handed over the package. The receptionist, seeing the Sinclair Technologies corporate logo, immediately walked it back to Julian's office. Julian took the envelope, assuming it was a signed copy of the contract or a last-minute addendum. He tore it open with a smug grin. As his eyes scanned the document, his smile vanished. His face flushed a deep, angry red, and the paper began to tremble in his hands. "What is it?" Sarah Croft asked, her tone shifting from playful to concerned. Julian didn't answer. He read the page again, his breathing becoming shallow. The letter was signed by Sinclair Technologies' general counsel. It was a formal notice of lease termination. The document was brief and devastating. It cited Section 14(4) of the Master Lease Agreement, dated September 1, 2016. The notice stated that because Adrian Vance, the designated property director and tenant liaison, had been terminated by Summit Realty Trust on August 20, 2026, Sinclair Technologies was exercising its absolute right to terminate the lease, effective in 10 days. Furthermore, the letter formally rejected the proposed renewal agreement. They would vacate the premises on or before August 31, 2026, and all future rent payments would cease. No, this is impossible," Julian muttered, scrambling to his computer. He pulled up the master database and opened the 2016 Sinclair lease file. He scrolled frantically to Section 14. There it was. Section 14(4), the Keyman and Asset Management Clause. It was written in plain, unambiguous legal language. If Adrian Vance ceased to manage the property, the tenant could walk away with zero penalty. "Sarah!" Julian roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "Did you review this lease before we fired Vance?" Sarah Croft went pale. I reviewed his employment contract, Julian. You told me to focus on his severance and the commission waiver. The lease agreement is handled by the operations department. I didn't think an employee's status would affect a commercial tenant's lease." "Get Higgins in here," Julian screamed. "Call Sinclair's office. Get Edward on the phone right now." But Edward Sinclair was not taking calls. When Julian dialed his direct line, he was routed to Sinclair's legal department. A cold voice informed him that Sinclair Technologies was acting strictly within its contractual rights, and that all future communications must go through their external law firm. While panic was consuming the penthouse of Summit Plaza, I was sitting in a quiet, high-end cafe 3 blocks away. Across from me sat Bradley Ward, a senior partner at Stonebridge Capital, a private equity firm specializing in distressed commercial real estate. Bradley was 52, analytical, and had access to a $500 million acquisition fund. I had known Bradley for 12 years, and we had partnered on several smaller syndications in the past. "You're sure about the numbers, Adrian?" Bradley asked, reviewing the spreadsheet I had printed out. "I know them by heart, Bradley," I said, taking a sip of black coffee. "Sinclair Technologies occupies 250,000 square feet. They pay $8 million a year. That's 60% of the building's total rent. The remaining 40% is split between small retail tenants on the ground floor and mid-sized professional service firms. The building's current net operating income is $10.5 million. At a 7% capitalization rate, the plaza is valued at approximately $150 million. And without Sinclair?" Bradley asked, leaning forward. "Without Sinclair, the occupancy drops to 38%, I explained. The ground floor retail tenants have co-tenancy clauses. If the anchor tenant leaves, their rent is automatically cut by 50%, or they can terminate their leases. The building's net operating income will plunge from $10.5 million to just $2.5 million. At the same 7% cap rate, the building's valuation will crash to $35.7 million. It's a 75% drop in value." Bradley smiled, his eyes gleaming with the predatory instinct of a seasoned investor. "And what about their debt? That's the beauty of it," I said. "George Mercer refinanced the property in 2021 with a $100 million first mortgage from Pacific National Bank. The loan has a debt service coverage ratio covenant of 1.25. Currently, the DSCR is a healthy 1.8. But once Sinclair leaves, the DSCR will drop to 0.45. The building won't generate enough cash flow to cover the monthly interest payments, let alone the principal, which triggers a technical default, Bradley noted. Exactly, I said. Pacific National Bank has a strict policy on commercial real estate exposure in this market. They don't want a half-empty office tower on their books, and they certainly don't want to go through a long public foreclosure process. Summit Realty Trust is highly leveraged. They don't have the cash reserves to pay down the principal to rebalance the loan. Julian Mercer is trapped. So, what is your play, Adrian? Bradley asked. We go to Pacific National Bank, I said. We offer to buy the defaulted mortgage note directly from them. In this market, a defaulted $100 million office note is a toxic asset. The bank will gladly sell it to us as a steep discount just to get it off their balance sheet. We offer them $45 million in cash. Stonebridge Capital provides the capital, and I manage the acquisition and the property. And once we own the note, we foreclose on Summit Realty Trust, I said. We take ownership of Summit Plaza, and once I am the owner, I bring Sinclair Technologies back. Edward Sinclair has already agreed. He will sign a new 5-year lease with us. The building's valuation jumps right back to over $100 million, and we acquire a trophy asset for less than half its value. Bradley stared at me for a few seconds, then extended his hand. Adrian, this is brilliant. Let's go to the bank. By the following Wednesday, the visual reality of Sinclair Technologies' departure had turned Summit Plaza into a scene of panic. Large, specialized moving trucks lined the loading docks. Teams of technicians in high-visibility vests were loading heavy server racks and delicate optical laboratory equipment into climate-controlled trailers. It was a massive, highly visible exit. The physical departure of the anchor tenant sent shockwaves through the rest of the building. The smaller retail tenants in the lobby, the high-end espresso bar, the corporate printing shop, the boutique gym, and the dry cleaner realized what was happening. Their business model depended entirely on the 2,000 high-earning Sinclair employees who occupied the upper floors. By Thursday afternoon, the owners of these retail spaces had consulted their legal advisors. Every single one of their leases contained a co-tenancy clause. Section 9. 2 of the retail lease agreements stated that if the anchor tenant vacated more than 50% of its space, the retail tenants were automatically entitled to cut their rent by 50% until a new anchor tenant was secured, or they could terminate their leases entirely with 30 days' notice. Within 48 hours, 5 separate retail tenants have served Summit Realty Trust with formal notices of rent reduction. Summit's monthly cash flow, already decimated by the loss of Sinclair's $8 million annual rent, collapsed by another $80,000. On Friday, the hammer fell. Michael Albright, the senior vice president of commercial lending at Pacific National Bank, sent a formal letter to Julian Mercer. The bank was invoking the covenant in the mortgage agreement. Since the debt service coverage ratio had fallen to 0.45, well below the required 1.25, Summit Realty Trust was in technical default. The bank demanded that Summit immediately deposit $25 million into a reserve account to rebalance the loan-to-value ratio, or the entire $100 million principal would be accelerated. Julian Mercer was forced to call an emergency board meeting. His uncle, George Mercer, joined via a secure video link from his home in Palm Springs. George looked frail, but his eyes were sharp and filled with concern. Julian, George said, his voice crackling over the speaker, explain to the board how we went from a $40 million lease renewal to a technical default on our flagship property in less than a week. Julian, sweating profusely, tried to shift the blame. It was sabotage, Uncle George. Adrian Vance conspired with Edward Sinclair. He must have had an under-the-table deal with Sinclair to move them to Bellevue. Vance was overpaid, and when we tried to optimize our overhead by letting him go, he steered our anchor tenant away to hurt the company. We are preparing a lawsuit against Vance for breach of fiduciary duty. George Mercer shook his head. Fiduciary duty? Julian, Adrian Vance worked for me for 15 years. He built this company's reputation. Did you look at the key man clause in Sinclair's lease before you terminated him? Julian stammered. It was a minor operational clause. Nobody uses those to cancel a $40 million contract. Edward Sinclair does, George snapped. He demanded that clause because he didn't trust our operational capabilities without Adrian. You thought you were saving $1 million commission, and instead, you've destroyed a $100 million asset. Before Julian could respond, his assistant knocked on the door and handed him a phone. Julian, it's Michael Albright from Pacific National Bank. He says it's urgent. Julian, hoping to show the board that he could negotiate a waiver, put the call on speaker. Michael, Julian said, trying to sound confident. We are in the middle of a board meeting. We are preparing a restructuring plan for the plaza. We can discuss the $25 million deposit. Julian. Albright's voice came through the speaker, clear and cold. I'm calling to let you know the situation has changed. Pacific National Bank has sold the mortgage note for Summit Plaza. Julian froze. Sold it? To whom? Yesterday afternoon, the debt was purchased by Stonebridge Debt Acquisition LLC, a subsidiary of Stonebridge Capital, Albright explained. They paid $45 million in cash for the note and all associated rights. As of today, Pacific National Bank is no longer your lender. Stonebridge holds the mortgage, and they are now the primary creditor. You must direct all future communications, rent accounts, and legal notices to them. Julian's voice trembled. Who is the managing partner for the Stonebridge acquisition? The designated managing director for the property acquisition and management is Adrian Vance, Albright said. Have a good day, Julian. The speaker went silent. The board members on the Zoom screen erupted into shouting. George Mercer stared at his nephew with absolute disgust. You idiot, George whispered. He's going to take the building. The next morning, the elevator doors of the 20th floor opened and I stepped out. I wasn't carrying a cardboard box this time. I was accompanied by Bradley Ward and a team of forensic accountants and legal counsels from Stonebridge. Julian Mercer ran out of his office, his tie askew, his face pale and sweating. Vance, he yelled, pointing a finger at me. You think you're clever? This is a hostile takeover. We are suing you. You stole our proprietary information. You sabotaged our relationship with Sinclair. I stopped and looked at him. I didn't smile, and I didn't raise my voice. Julian, everything I did was based on public filings and contracts that your company signed. You terminated me, which triggered Sinclair's contractual exit. When the bank put the defaulted debt up for sale, we bought it. It's a standard commercial transaction. Bradley Ward stepped forward and handed Julian a thick legal document. This is a formal notice of intent to foreclose and demand for possession. Since Summit Realty Trust has defaulted on the mortgage covenants and failed to pay the accelerated balance, we are taking control of the property. We have already filed the paperwork with the court. You can't do this, Julian yelled. We have tenant leases. We have our corporate headquarters right here. Actually, I said, that brings me to my next point. Summit Realty Trust's corporate headquarters occupies the 20th floor under a commercial lease. According to our audits, Summit Realty Trust failed to pay its portion of the shared operating expenses and common area maintenance fees for the last month. That is a material breach of your own lease. As the new landlord, I am serving you with a 3-day notice to pay or quit. If you don't pay the outstanding balance of $98,000 by Monday at 5 p.m., we will evict your corporate offices from this building. Monday at 5 p.m. came and went. Summit Realty Trust, with its accounts frozen due to the default in the pending foreclosure lawsuit, was unable to pay the $98,000 in outstanding common area maintenance fees. Under the strict terms of the lease and the local commercial real estate codes, Stonebridge Capital officially filed for eviction and moved to take physical possession of the 20th floor. The court acted swiftly. Given the massive financial default on the $100 million mortgage, the judge appointed a receiver to oversee the property and protect the asset. Because of my deep familiarity with the building and my 15 years of flawless management history, the receiver immediately appointed me as the managing agent for the property. My first act as managing agent was to invite Edward Sinclair back to the negotiation table. We met in the conference room of Sinclair's temporary offices. Edward looked at me with a wide grin, shaking his head in amusement. I have to say, Adrian, Edward said, signing the document folder in front of him, I've seen some corporate battles in my time, but buying the mortgage note of the building you were fired from is on another level. It was a simple mathematical decision, Edward, I replied. Julian Mercer looked at the spreadsheet and saw a cost to be cut. He didn't see the value of the relationship. We signed the new lease. To show our appreciation for Sinclair's loyalty and to secure a long-term commitment, Stonebridge offered a slight concession. A 5-year master lease for the 250,000 square feet at $7.5 million per year, instead of the original $8 million. It was a win-win. Sinclair saved $2.5 million over the life of the lease, while Stonebridge secured $37.5 million in guaranteed rental income. With Sinclair Technologies officially returning and the moving trucks reversing their routes, the building's valuation instantly stabilized. The retail tenants in the lobby, seeing the anchor tenant return, withdrew their rent reduction notices. The high-end cafe, the print shop, and the gym were saved from ruin. The net operating income of the building was locked in at $10 million. At the 7% capitalization rate, the plaza's market value was officially appraised at $107 million. For Summit Realty Trust, the situation was catastrophic. The company was facing a massive default, and the board members were personally liable under corporate guarantees. During an emergency meeting, the board voted unanimously to strip Julian Mercer of his title and authority, firing him effective immediately. Sarah Croft was also terminated for gross negligence in failing to perform due diligence on my contract and the Sinclair lease. A few days later, George Mercer called me. His voice sounded tired, stripped of the old vigor he once had. "Adrian," George said, "I want to apologize. I should never have let Julian take over the operations. He was arrogant, and he destroyed what took us decades to build. We want to settle this foreclosure lawsuit. We don't have the cash to pay off the note." "I'm listening, George," I said. We worked out a settlement agreement. Summit Realty Trust agreed to transfer all of their remaining equity and ownership rights in Summit Plaza to Stonebridge Capital. In exchange, Stonebridge agreed to release Summit Realty Trust and its board members from the personal and corporate guarantees on the $100 million mortgage. It was a clean break. Summit Realty Trust was saved from complete liquidation, but they lost their crown jewel. I insisted on one final, non-negotiable clause in the settlement. Julian Mercer was to be officially stripped of all shares in Summit Realty Trust, barred from ever holding an executive position or board seat in the company, and officially blacklisted from any future real estate dealings associated with our properties. The board signed without hesitation. Julian was cast out, his reputation in the Pacific Northwest real estate market completely ruined. No commercial bank would ever lend to him, and no developer would ever hire him. 3 weeks after I was escorted out of the lobby with a cardboard box, I walked back into the penthouse suite. The mahogany desk was clean. The catered champagne and fancy food were gone. The glass walls showed the sweeping skyline of Seattle, the Puget Sound glittering in the late afternoon sun. Bradley Ward walked in carrying a folder. "The final papers are signed, Adrian. The deed is recorded in our name. Stonebridge Real Estate Holdings is the official owner of Summit Plaza. And my equity?" I asked. 20%, Bradley said, handing me the ownership certificate. "Just as we agreed. Your share of the building's equity is valued at $12.4 million based on the new appraisal. Plus, you are the managing partner of the property, with a base salary of $250,000 a year and a percentage of the annual net income." I looked at the certificate. 15 years of hard work had been dismissed by a greedy young executive trying to pocket a $1.2 million commission. Julian Mercer thought he was playing a simple game of cost reduction. He didn't realize that in commercial real estate, the rules of the game are written in the fine print of the contracts, and the players who build the relationships are the ones who control the board. I sat down in the executive chair looking out at the city. My personal phone rang. It was the building engineer, letting me know that the cooling system in the server rooms need a routine check. "I'll be right down," I said, smiling.